Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, we reconvene with a keynote from Dr. Nicholas Tate, historian, author, and former head of the UK Curriculum Council. A respected voice in conservative education, Dr. Tate's vision for curriculum integrity and moral clarity will guide our transition into the next panel. Please, Dr. Tate, share your thoughts with us.
Thank you all very much. My topic is education and the nation state. My justification for proposing that topic for my chapter in the book, Reclaiming Classical Education, was that learning about one's nation state, and indeed about one's nation, the two things aren't the same, is and should be an important part of that transmission of inherited culture and knowledge that's at the heart of a classical or liberal education. First, a quick word about nomenclature. I refer to a liberal education and not to a classical education in my chapter. In normal usage in England, classical education means either the classical pedagogical approaches bequeathed to us by the Greeks and the Romans, or to the induction into the Greek and Latin languages and their associated civilizations, or both together. The concept of a liberal education is much more open. Its main defining characteristic is the development of qualities worthy in themselves and which are not being pursued for the sake of any utilitarian benefits. Education strongly focused on the nation and the nation state doesn't fit neatly into classical education centered on ancient civilizations, nor does it fit neatly with the notion of a Christian religion, which has been the other main influence on European education over the past 2 millennia and which transcends national boundaries. But there was much in the Greek city-states and in both republican and imperial Rome with which analogies could be and were made. There's also, of course, much more in what most people in this conference call a classical education than the trivium and classical languages and civilizations. And I'm sure that this wider use of the term classical education, I notice in the book the phrase classic liberal education is also used. I hope in time that will become more generally known. It is not as yet generally known in the UK. Seeing the nation and the nation state as central to education is easier with the concept of a liberal education, which since the 16th century has often been used as a term. You look at the complete Oxford English Dictionary, and there it is at some point in the late 16th century, liberal education. An education which is defined as one emphasizing character, sociability, and virtue, as much as the cultivation of the mind. A liberal education has often been seen as the education of a gentleman. It was not aimed at scholarship, the transmission of essential knowledge, habits, manners, and morals. Such aims were worthy in themselves, but also were the aims needed by those expected to play an honourable part in their community and in their nation state. Adapted to a democratic and more egalitarian world, I see these as vital continuing aims. When a Conservative government first introduced a national curriculum in England in the early 1990s, no one used the terms liberal or classical in relation to it. It was, however, very much a liberal education. It was strong on transmission, a knowledge-rich history curriculum presented chronologically, a stress on classic texts in literature, a strong science program, Christianity to be the main element in religious education, even the maintenance of the traditional requirement for daily collective worship, massively ignored in British schools then and now. But it's still on the statute book. The new curriculum, through its program of transmission, provided a basis for an education that would enable pupils to develop their own sense of belonging to the nation and the nation state. And of course, we have three interlocking ones in the UK, England, Britain, and the United Kingdom, of which they're a part. But we didn't make this explicit in the curriculum, which was a major omission. I therefore took it upon myself when I became head of the National Curriculum and Assessment Agency to promote publicly at every opportunity the notion that enabling, not imposing, the development of a sense of national identity was an important and crucial educational objective. What my article in the book is mostly about are the reasons why I think the nation state is more numerous than ever before, why it continues to thrive, why it remains crucially important, and why education can play a part in weakening the powerful forces of oikophobia. We've heard about oikophilia today, oikophobia, Roger Scruton's term for distaste towards what is one's own, a phenomenon pretty prevailing in large parts of the Western world. I've been recently preparing to move house, and I've been sorting out my... There's a purpose to this anecdote, by the way. It's not just me talking about my own life. Been sorting out my archives and found all the daily press digests I received when this topic was hot news in the national press. I was called ridiculous, a neo-racist, a cultural restorationist, a neo-conservative, and a cultural imperialist. Despite which, the response in the press, I found looking back at it now, was rather more positive than negative, with a willingness on the part of many to see that there were different points of view on this issue. The press admittedly sought out students I'd once taught years before in a school and trainee teachers I'd supervised on teaching practice to see what negative things they could say about me. They also found disaffected left-wing members of my staff to tell them how dreadful it was to have a boss with such appalling views. But, and this is the point of the anecdote, I never feared being cancelled, nor did I lose my job when, after the 1997 general election, I found myself working under a Labour Secretary of State for Education. In the current world of X, TikTok, Instagram, and so on, I would not have lasted long in an official position. And thinking back to those times has made me realise how much more difficult it is conducting these debates today for anyone holding a post and earning a salary. I think we've taken a step backwards. There were some rational arguments against the idea that schools should be consciously passing on a heritage that would enable pupils to develop a sense of membership of a national community. The complexity of membership of what one of my most articulate critics kept on calling the disunited kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland was certainly an issue that needed to be addressed, but in my opinion was all the more reason for pupils to learn how this unstable union had come about and to form their own views about their participation or otherwise in it. Similarly, with the concepts of majority culture and a high culture that I argued should shape our curricular choices, the obvious difficulty of deciding what qualifies and what doesn't under both those headings shouldn't lead to the complete abandonment of any attempt to discriminate between a major curricular emphasis and a minor one. The implication of the criticism of even thinking about education for national identity was that what I was proposing was indoctrination into a harmful way of viewing the world. Having rejected my focus on membership of a nation state, the critic I mentioned earlier concluded with his own recommendation that a history curriculum, and I quote, cultivates universal values such as tolerance, social justice, and honesty, looks outwards, not inwards, and recognizes and celebrates a multiplicity of potential identities. The implication was that somehow these aims, with most of which I wouldn't actually disagree, were self-evidently right, whereas mine were self-evidently wrong. Indoctrination is a term that's often used on both sides of debates about the school curriculum. It's not always a helpful word. There's a very good article in a recent edition of the journal Philosophy of Education, which in effect recommends that the word be largely dropped from educational discussions as one that's unable to do much more than express someone's subjective opinion. If one believes that a central aim of education is the development of a sense of global citizenship, which is the declared aim of most of the schools in the international education sector, in which I've also worked for many years, one would regard an education focused on national citizenship as inculcating harmful views, and thus might be inclined also to call it indoctrination and vice versa. One would be better advised, however, to avoid name-calling and instead to lay out the arguments for and against the two approaches and make a considered decision on the basis of one's conclusions. Now, none of this is to suggest that one cannot distinguish between curriculum content that's ideologically one-sided and content that is rigorous and nuanced. Indeed, in a world keen to use the curriculum to promote contemporary courses, it's the key distinction that we often need to keep on making. In creating the conditions in which a sense of national identity might flourish, things are clearly unacceptable. You don't present contested issues in a partisan way. You don't use the curriculum to promote contemporary causes. You don't censor views thoughtfully expressed in discussion. You don't put pressure on pupils to accept positions they don't share. We cannot and should not force a sense of nationality on people, but that doesn't mean that we should not encourage it or be anything but concerned about its absence, both among pupils and among teachers. In conclusion, the obstacles to helping to develop a sense of nationality remain legion. They include all the ideological currents that flow into the oikophobia that I analyse in my chapter. The prominence of these attitudes among progressive elites who've captured key cultural bodies. If you want to see an example of what I'm referring to, look at the UK Classical Association's website and look into their Queering the Past materials. Look at the UK Historical Association's website and look into their webinar series on decolonising the curriculum. These are the authoritative national bodies established over 100 years ago, and that's where they are now. Look at the divisive Black History, Women's History, and Muslim History months, in which depressingly large numbers of British schools take part. By the way, happy Pride Month to all of you. It began yesterday. If you didn't know, some of you knew, but some of you perhaps didn't. I hope you didn't, actually. It'd be good if you didn't know. The obstacles also include the flood of free materials produced by activists, which bring, and I quote a phrase from a brilliant report by the UK Policy Exchange into the history curriculum, which came out a couple of weeks ago, bring highly contested narratives from the academy, and we know what the academy is like in the Western world, into mainstream teaching. Obstacles include the fact that some of these contested narratives remain central to initial teacher education programs. So these ideas are coming into schools with large numbers of new teachers. And given the turnover of teachers in England, 31% leave every 5 years, lots and lots of new teachers are coming in with these views that they've had from initial teacher education. And finally, the obstacle is the continued open and widespread acceptance in some quarters that the purpose of education is, and I quote a phrase used by people who are doing it, curating minds. I remember a credible article in the Times Education Supplement from a young teacher about our job is to curate minds and to make sure that people don't go along with what it talked about as the reactionary Brexit revolution and Trump in the USA and so on. The notion that the purpose of education is to get young people to sign up to progressive causes. Okay, I'm coming to an end. The struggle for classical and liberal education and for an education that doesn't form the nation state therefore continues, not just in the state sector, but at least in England, in the private sector, some of whose heads in the past have been among the most craven in giving way to pressures that ought to have been resisted. So I come into this conference quite pessimistic about the continuing strength of these powerful forces acting against the kind of education I've been advocating for decades. But I'm optimistic, however, that I will leave the conference, especially after the sessions after lunch, reassured at some of the classical education initiatives that are taking place and which leave one feeling full of hope for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tate. And now we will go on with the panel, which is borrowing the title from your famous book, Against the Current. And I will call the other panelists to the stage. And please, when you hear your name, take your seat. And first, let me invite the engine of this conference and the moderator, Richard Fodor, who's head of research at MCC Learning Institute, certified high school teacher of history and English language, assistant lecturer at Péter Pázmány Catholic University. Dr. Joanna Williams, former visiting fellow at MCC, founder and director of KIO, and she taught at the University of Kent for over 10 years. I invite Professor Dr. Cornelis Schilt from Vrije Universiteit Brussels. Dr. Alex Standish, Associate Professor at the University College London and Fellow of the Royal Geographic Society. And finally, I invite Dr. Artur Górecki, Director.
Now I think it's working. Thank you very much for coming, and we will start this second panel, and at the end you will have also the opportunity to ask the panelists. Let's talk about the book first. Joanna will have a keynote lecture dedicated to the whole concept of reclaiming classical education and the process of the editorial work. And let's talk about the second chapter, which is dedicated to history education and historiography. My question is that you have dedicated a lengthy time and length in your chapter in connection with the history education. What is the ideal role of history in a young learner's life, and how do you see the status of history education currently in the UK, Belgium, and Poland, respectively?
I think history is probably one of the most important subjects that children can learn at school, because it gives them a grounding. It should give them a grounding in the past, a sense of belonging to the nation, as Nick outlined in his keynote, a sense of roots, if you like, a sense of where they have come from, a sense of the society that they've been born into. I think the main problem at the moment is that history education does not do this at all, because the starting premise, it seems to me, for much history teaching, particularly in the UK, is not actually the past, but it is the present, and it is political concerns in the present, and how the past can be used as a narrative to make political arguments in the present. So all too often it seems to me that we start with present concerns, for example, the need to challenge racism. So then the past is read backwards, either to provide examples of racism or, even worse, to misread, to make up, essentially, racism that occurred, or to find examples of progressivism. So I'll be more specific. A story that was in the newspaper in the UK just yesterday argued that teachers should be telling children in history lessons that the Vikings were also people of colour. That Viking invaders were not just white. And this is a kind of identitarian representation, so we can have black people essentially on the school history curriculum, but in a way that is historically illiterate and doesn't actually have a grounding in history. And I think that's the big problem. History should be about providing children with roots, with a sense of identity, a sense of their national story. And at the moment, it's not. It's being bent to political purposes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. I agree with a lot of that. I won't talk about sort of what's going wrong, but more about maybe what I'd like it to be. And I'm going to bring geography in here because geography is my subject. And it's certainly geography in the UK and I think in other countries does play a role in civics. I think it takes on a lot of those issues in developing citizenship. So I think collectively, I mean, firstly, I'd say that those subjects collectively introduce children to the world. They take children beyond their own experience. They learn about different places, different times. They learn about different cultures, explore different cultures around the world. How can you possibly know what your own culture is until you've explored other cultures and learnt about the differences between different cultures and then come back to look at your own culture? So that's definitely a key part of those subjects collectively. And then I would say that it develops understanding of human subjectivity, of who we are. Again, that you learn about what people have achieved, the problems they've experienced, the challenges in the past, in the present, and in different places. So you explore our relationship with the environment and how people are struggling in zones of seismicity or areas of drought, areas of poverty. How can you learn about development if you don't know differences in development in different countries, at different stages of development, or where we've come from in the past to where we've come to the present? And then finally, I'd say maybe interconnection. Again, the way in which we're connected, both past, present, and future, and the way we're connected to other parts of the world, culturally, economically, socially. So, that's my start.
So maybe a reason why I'm here, because Piotr Kazanowski was supposed to be here instead of me, but he got sick, unfortunately. So as I am a historian and I have some kind of knowledge related to teaching history of Poland, I allowed myself to take part in this panel. So I think that in the case of Poland, the biggest danger when we talk about teaching history is the fact that it is very strongly politicized. So every change after the elections of the governments usually means the change of curriculum also in this subject. And of course teaching and the governors, they are very much interested in the newest history. So the biggest changes are concerned how do we describe our reality in Poland after the Second World War. So what were the consequences, what we called the Polish communism? Can we defend this concept, or is it a continuation of the before-war Poland, or was it a break in this continuum, or maybe only the 1989 brought us the new wave of freedom and the new question of the Third Polish Republic, when it was born? Was it a treason in Magdalenka and the Round Table? So there is a kind of sin in its very beginning that we cannot eradicate, and we're waiting for a kind of new Fourth Republic. Has it already occurred? Has it yet? There are different stories about that, depending who is talking from which political side will pronounce himself. But even though I will not tell who is right, but when we take the teacher's perspective, the result is that there is a kind of shifting of the history interest about I'm talking about the newest history. So what we should wait to have a better perspective, to have a good perspective as a historian, version to take conclusions. For example, when I was studying history at the Warsaw University, my teachers, my professors were telling me, when I was talking about an event that was not younger than 300 years, they were saying it's not for a historian. We are not dealing with that. Here are political science, but this is not history. We have not the proper distance, perspective. The testimony cannot talk about history from his own way. This is how, of course, this kind of workshop can be discussed, but I'm recalling that because this is a kind of shift in the school nowadays. When they try to argue the argument that the students are overloaded, we are reducing the curriculum about the elder times. The antiquity and medieval ages are suffering the most. The Renaissance is the beginning of the new world that most people identify with, but the full identify is the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the 18th century, which has shaped this world where we live nowadays, and that most people agree with its values, and the liberal leftist people agree with. So this is when the world began for them. So when we give children this kind of conviction that what is worthy, what is valuable, was born with the French Revolution, and we do not give the chance to get to know this world that is closer to them, but also to the ancient times when it comes to regulating the social times, the relations between the governors, the subjects, the objects, later the citizens, then what is happening? It's a very dangerous reduction of limiting the curriculum in this very aspect. When I was in the Ministry of Education, I was experiencing these internal battles, pressures. I was fighting for this very, what I'm talking about, with my full conviction. Yes, of course, there were such trials, even when we talk about the governors that is looked for as the right, conservative one, to resign, to leave alone this eldest history and start from the 15th century or maybe 16th, and maybe we can tell some stories, nice stories from the past. And the second thing that I would like to end up with, the historical lecture should be chronological one, not with problems. We have experienced such an experiment when they tried to teach us, for example, taking the economic perspective, and we're taking it from the past, from the antiquity to the modern times. And of course, we are usually, what has been mentioned by the speaker here, the anachronism has been here, and this is not the way to learn history. And the second thing, we cannot learn history when we think only about tests and exams. We think about graduating, the final exam. For example, after the primary school, you do not have any history exam, but the first external exam that the student has to face is the one after the secondary school, but usually for those who choose history, and in Poland, it's only about 5% of Polish students who choose the subject for their graduating exam. So from all the graduated, only 5% choose history in the extended version. And if we have the whole curriculum just for that to pass the exam, this is not the same thing as learning history. So preparing for a test and learning is different things.
Thank you very much. Clearly this is a topic that is very dear to us. There are no short answers. But let me put it this, as short as I can. History equals identity. We are intimately connected with our past. I teach history in Brussels to second and third and fourth generation atheists. The free in my Vrije Universiteit of Brussels means free thinking, free masonry, free from Catholic religious influences. A generation grows up in Belgium that is completely detached from its Catholic past. So concepts of organized religion might still be vaguely familiar to them. They see cathedrals, they see the processions, because there are still Catholics left in Belgium. But the whole idea of the metaphysical, of a divine realm, of something spiritual, is quite alien to them. If you were to study a degree in history at my university, you would not be able to find one. Yes, there is a degree called history. It's a bachelor program. And what it teaches is Marxist history. But it doesn't call it Marxist history, it calls it history. That's because all staff are Marxists. You thought communism was gone? It's alive and kicking in the West. 99% of my colleagues in the humanities, so that's philosophy, history, English literature, and so on, are socialist or worse. Our students don't stand a chance. When they study history, what they receive is Marxist history, and they don't know it. They can't recognize it. There is nothing else. History is taught with power dynamics. Can I have a different? This one is better. You can see that the powers of evil are interfering already. Brussels is never far away from where we are, you know, somewhere, somehow. Or it could be the Chinese, who knows? I was in China 3 weeks ago. The Chinese are more religious than the Europeans on average now. Let that sink in. That sounds unbelievable. That's what I thought. Turns out it's true. But that's an aside. History is identity. Teaching of history is directly rooted, or directly roots us in who we are. In Europe, in the center of Europe, in Brussels, allegedly the center of Europe, history is being used to reprogram the next generations, to turn them into good economic units, useful idiots. And I say that with the deepest respect for idiots. The students are victims. We are sacrificing generations and generations of kids if we don't take steps and take education in our own hands. And I'm sure that we will discuss this further.
I'll say something very briefly about why history is important, and then say a few words about history in the UK from the perspective of someone who has spent many years building a national curriculum and then slimming it down and then rebuilding it and then slimming it down again. As far as purposes of history, we keep on being told that the age of meta-narratives is behind us, that the world is too complicated, our understanding is so sophisticated, that all the meta-narratives that we had, this sense of a past coming through various civilizations and through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution, that these meta-narratives really just are a very clumsy imposition on a chaos of events. Well, I'm really keen to keep on imposing a clumsy version of the past on children in schools so that they have a sense of a chronology. They have a meta-narrative, which when they grow up and become sophisticated, they can see is not as simple as they thought it was in school. Because as you grow up, you see things are more complex. But you know, the notion of a meta... I haven't actually said this before. The thought came into my head the first time this morning. The notion that history should be about creating a meta-narrative. I've always said it should be chronological, but I think there should be this picture in your head. I remember when I did my final exams at Oxford for a history degree, and we had 6 days of 2 3-hour papers a day, and it was chronological. In my head was a meta. I walked around the gardens of the college, and in my head was this meta-narrative, you know, from the Greeks and the Romans right up to the 20th century, trying to fit it all in. And I would love that to be passed on to the next generation in schools. As far as history in England is concerned, what I've learned over the last 20, 30 years is that in making a national curriculum, you shouldn't make it so prescriptive that it becomes burdensome and unpopular and undoable in practice, nor should you make it so open that teachers can interpret it in a wide range of different ways. Or if you leave it reasonably open, you have to be very clear what the key elements are, and you need to assess them or inspect them so that the data is coming back to show people that they should be doing things. this policy exchange report that I mentioned earlier, which came out a few weeks ago about the state of history teaching among 11 to 14-year-olds, quite narrow, but 100 pages, very detailed survey of large numbers of schools, shows that crucial elements of the national curriculum are not taught. Only 20% of schools teach, and they cease learning history at the age of 14, in some cases 13 in England. Only 20% of schools teach two of the most crucial elements in our constitutional history. They don't learn about the 1688 Glorious Revolution, which is when an intermittently absolute monarchy turned into a constitutional monarchy, which we now have, and they don't learn about the Act of Union or the Treaty of Union, as Stuart would call it, of 1707 between England and Scotland. These are two absolutely determining events. 80% of kids don't hear the names of these things. So, you know, there are major deficiencies, and this policy exchange report comes up with some suggestions about remedying it. One of the good things is that history teachers are among the best qualified teachers in schools. Virtually everybody gets a qualified graduate history teacher. And also history is the most popular subject that people choose to do in the exams at 16 when they have a choice, outside the 4 or 5 basic subjects that everybody has to do. So something is happening to enthuse people about history and want to continue to study it.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. Then the idea of the nation state and the idea of the European Union has also been raised. And there has been a heavily criticized, firstly, report, secondly, resolution by the European Parliament dedicated to the European historical consciousness, which was called, or which basically prioritizes the European history over the national history in Europe, and which was called a Voltaire satire by Cornelis. Could you elaborate on it, please? And after that, Nick and Professor Górecki and
Yeah, so on December 5th, 2023, a seemingly innocuous report was published or passed by the European Commission, I think, mandating history education throughout Europe because the past was evil. It was full of people hating each other. You know, people who were anti-Semitic, anti-Gypsy, which is now a thing apparently, anti-women, of course. At least half the people were anti-women. Not sure about the other half. Think that one through, please. Everything in the past was bad. And what's especially bad is any form of history teaching that prioritizes national identity. You should not be proud of your country. You should not be proud of your ethnicity. You should not be proud of your past. No. But we have the solution. We promise you a new sanitized history where we learn from our mistakes and where we implement all these new solutions, these newly constructed solutions, to use a term from one of the previous speakers. And this is sort of presented as academically sound, with all the academics working for the European Union, of course, so no objectivity. But it's also presented in a way as we need to be objective. We need to present objective history. It needs to be fact-based. We don't need all these strange narratives that are polarizing and that are presenting history as one-sided. Objectivity, objectivity, objectivity. And I called it a Voltairesque satire because the whole thing is completely subjective. It has nothing to do with facts. And moreover, it immediately turns history into a political tool, as we discussed already. Nowhere was it stated in a sense that history itself should be about facts and teaching facts without any connotation, oddly enough. Every sentence that said fact-based was immediately followed by how those alleged facts should then be interpreted, as subjective as possible. So reading through this report, for my sins, I'm a Catholic, reading through this report, I was thinking, this is ridiculous. Anyone with half a brain reading this would think this is a satire. This is a silly narrative. This has nothing to do with reality. Well, this is what comes out of Brussels.
I couldn't agree more. I refer you to MCC Brussels' excellent briefing. I think Joanna edited it about this EU report, this Council of Europe report, and the various proposals in it. I mean, it's an object lesson in how not to do history, how not to focus on knowledge, how not to focus on the nation, how to ignore academic expertise, how to ignore balance. How to see contemporary developments as dominating everything you choose to do when talking about the past. I don't think I've got any more to add than that.
So the report that you have mentioned is actually just one of the elements of the complex, very well-thought plan of institutional influence, interference in the EU on the national states. And in Poland, for example, I don't know if it's just one of the examples how it looks like in your countries, but we see it through the financing of educational programs when the EU gives money that can be reached by local governments or schools because it's for free, so they're very willing to take this money, but the cost is that they include the content that is supposed to blur the national identity, to build the European identity. Our current government in March last year has announced promoting European clubs in schools with a whole flood of money from the EU. There were supposed to be clubs in every school, and they were supposed to talk about the European Union. So, in theory, there is nothing bad in that, but they are supposed to talk about only the affirmative way, to show the EU as a great country full of richness, the place where we can thrive, we can feel grateful, we can feel good. We don't know whom we should be grateful to, but our, some strange cultures, dark cultures, the historical reasons, this is nothing of an importance. So we finance excursions within the programs. For example, for secondary schools or academic students, they are also to shape this multicultural conviction that we have no criteria, the cultures cannot be judged, cannot be valued, assessed. The Incas culture is the same as where, for example, there was a sacrificing of hundreds of men, has the same value as the very niche Christian culture that has destroyed the Incas culture, which is a horrible thing. So when we come to the things, the details, those environments in this report and other EU documents, they have found, they have already had their influence. Our government has prepared the curriculum that we have citizenship education that is to change the history and the current times. And they say very exactly what are the areas where you belong to. We do not start with the family and the nation, but we start with those artificial ones, like, for example, kind of European identity. It's very hard for me to speak about that because I have no idea what is it European identity. I don't know how to define it. I can talk about Christianitas, the Latin civilization. This is what I can define. But what is a European identity? I have no idea, and maybe this is what it is supposed to be. It should be blurred, so that nobody has any deeper thought about that. Thanks.
Professor Standish, let me ask you about the European status of geography. Is it similarly affected, or is it similarly influenced by the European politics?
Status of geography in the UK. Is it influenced by? I mean, we left the European Union, as you know, 5 years ago. So I guess I was going to say that. I mean, despite that, we don't have there's a very weak sense of Britishness and nationality in the UK. If anything, I think we're less patriotic than most countries. So I don't even think there's a discussion really about what it means to be British in the UK. So as a starting point for the curriculum, that's not going to happen really, is it? In terms of the curriculum doing that. Does it affect geography? I mean, geography talks a lot about global citizenship, and effectively that means sort of it's very much individualization. It's sort of there are environmental problems, there are fast fashion, there are lots of topics in geography in which really you're just getting the individual to sort of link to these what are called global issues and shape their behaviors in relation to what's happening in Bangladesh or climate change. So there's a lot of I guess moralism, I would say, in geography. Just coming back to Britain, I mean, the only thing we do have is the previous government introduced British values into the national curriculum. So there are 5 British values, which are tolerance and respect for people of different cultures, individual liberty, the rule of law, and democracy. So there is that discussion, but at the time when it was brought in, people most people in the teaching profession just reacted to that. They were very unhappy that they were there, and they said these are not British values. So that's an example, I think, of how people react to it. There's one school we know of. We were discussing this last night. One school we know of that regularly sings the national anthem, and that's Michaela. If you've heard of Michaela College, run by Catherine Verbelsing, which is in Wembley. But there is not a strong sense of identity, I think.
Thank you. Just in relation to the previous question, I'm going to kick off by saying something which I think is probably incredibly controversial in this room, and to challenge Cornelis' previous point. I would actually like if there was a history department at the university that was full of Marxists, because I think one of the best things about Marxism is the guiding principle of historical materialism. And if there are anybody who really do know their history and have a proper sense of historical consciousness and are able to relate issues and understand issues in the historical specificity, then it's Marxists. And I think the problem we've got in our history departments at the moment is not that there's too many Marxists, but that there's people with no understanding of historical methodology, the historical specificity as a way of making sense of issues. And I actually think having more people who were influenced by Marxist methodology would be a really, really good thing. And I think we see the absence of this in the EU policies, where, again, it's not Marxism that we're worrying about, but the opposite of it, this kind of presenteeism and trying to make sense of history through the issues of the present. So I know that one huge topic that's preoccupying European Union officials at the moment is the concept of misinformation and disinformation, and how the education system can be used to challenge misinformation and disinformation. Now, you think if you had a proper grounding in historical knowledge, that would actually be a really good way of producing children who were able to think critically in relation to potential mis and disinformation. And the problem is children don't have that grounding, so they come across information that they might meet online without any way of making sense of it beyond the immediacy of what they're seeing there and then. But what's being proposed in history teaching is not giving children that historical specificity, skills of historical analysis to help them make sense of these things, but predetermined conclusions. So the fact that it is mis or disinformation has actually been decided in advance, and then children are kind of taught the values, if you like, that are meant to inoculate them against this, rather than any kind of historical understanding or methodological approach to analysis.
Nicholas said that he wanted to comment. After that, maybe Cornelis wants to react. And after that, we will open the floor for open discussion and your questions.
We've decided to disagree among ourselves to wake you up. can I disagree with Alex, who said, British identity, there isn't much British identity. I think what we're seeing in England at the moment, and to some extent, not other parts of the UK, we're seeing a reaction against a government which doesn't seem to be putting its nation first. I think there's a very powerful emerging sense of British identity that was always there. It was always there with the monarchy. I mean, the monarchy means a lot to people, especially outside the metropolis and certainly outside the educational world, and that gives people a sense of belonging to a community that goes back a very long way. And the problem with British values is that there is nothing British about them at all. They could be Hungarian values, Polish values, French values, US values. They're just universal values. The UN could have produced that document, not a British government. What we need, instead of some vacuous statement of values, what we need is learning about the 1688 Glorious Revolution and the 1707 Act of Union with Scotland, so they see how Britain came about.
Because yes, then British kids would have learned that the Dutch came to your salvation, in 1688, William III, that sort of stuff. But let's not go there. I mean, sense of national pride. I'm Dutch, by the way, not Belgian, in case you're wondering. I was always a fan of Eric Hobsbawm, one of the greatest Marxist historians ever lived, because he was very clearly Marxist historian. It was clear to everyone who picked up a book. I mean, the name. I mean, come on, Hobsbawm. You needed to spell that out for me. Kids can't spell anymore, so that's gone now. But anyway, this was a good historian because he realized the limitations and the strengths of his methodology. And you pick up Hobsbawm, you pick up people coming from other historiographical disciplines, and you could compare them. And you could see the strengths and disadvantages of each of those methods. My colleagues, who call themselves Marxist, but maybe should be labeled cultural Marxist or Foucauldian or what have you, can no longer do this. They would not even be able to appreciate Hobsbawm. The second thing I wanted to say, the greatest source of disinformation, misinformation today in Europe is, of course, the European Union. Full stop.
Hello. Yep. Just to respond to Nick. So I didn't say there wasn't a sense of Britishness. I said there was not a national discussion about it. But maybe that's changing with reform. Maybe they're putting that back on the agenda. But and I think within the teaching profession, it's it's obviously very progressive. So it's not much of a discussion there, but it's not much of a discussion in terms of national politics either. But I think you're right. There's something under the surface.
Thank you very much. And you have already signaled that you have a question. Maybe I will. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, the gentleman in the back.
My name's Stuart, chair of the Scottish Union for Education. So it's a campaign group. So I come across lots of different people, right? Academics, parents, teachers. Some of them are religious, some of them are not. Some of them are, I'm just going to shout, some of them are quite Scottish, some of them are quite British, some of them are not either. And this is a question I was going to put to the first panel, so I'm going to put it to you guys, is can you, I think you can have a classical education, but what is the ethos of the school, right? And I want you to tell me what the ethos of your school would be without using religion, or at least a specific religion, and without being nationalistic, or at least without being jingoistic. Because I think it should be possible, but I'm not sure people in this room ever think along those lines. We should be able to have a classical school system that is neither overtly Christian and overtly nationalistic. And I want you to tell me what that would be, and you're not allowed to be overtly Christian, overtly jingoistic.
Okay, we have time for another question, and collectively the panelists will answer them.
Not unrelated to that, but a bit different. I think the thing about the British values thing is that it was introduced very defensively for political reasons, and in the wake of 9/11 and growing perceptions of the Islamist risks within Britain from a security point of view. That is not a good reason for doing a national school level intervention. That is a reason for tightening up your security forces and to, other kind of policing things, but not schools. I think, for me, a value by its nature is transcendental, and therefore I think it is not tethered to a particular nation. However, I think there is culture, and I think often cultural values and moral values are conflated and confused, and I think we could possibly do well to start separating them out. And there are British cultural values, which is where it links to Stuart's question, that I think are necessary and are good, and we need to uphold.
Thank you very much. So the first one was in connection with the ethos of a school without religion, and the second one is this cultural related. And please be very, very brief because we have 12 minutes.
I will try to relate to the first question.
Nie ukrywam, że
I don't want to hide that this kind of vision is reducing. This is a coming back to the education from the level on the Greek and Roman education, Paideia and Roman Universitas, before completing it with this supernatural aspect from Christianity. And of course, we can imagine such a situation going to this side has gone, not leaving Alistair McLaren in his search for in his search of natural virtues. So what a human can discover in relation to himself and the world only using his natural intellect, his natural reason, excluding any revelation, excluding any subnatural way. So are we able to achieve the limit of the truth about the human? But it will always be not the full truth about the man, because we will always be moving within this life here now on earth. We will be able to describe what is the aim of this earthly life. It was already mentioned, those two aims, the earthly happiness, but also the latest, the final aim, eudaimonia, so looking God face to face. And when constructing the ethos of the school without relation to any religion, I think this is only the level that we will stay at. From my perspective, this is something that is only a partial truth about the human and the coming back to the world, to the Paideia, the Roman and Greek experience. But when it comes to this nationality, I think it's really easier to handle that, because I think that if we assume that the cognition are about the objective truth about the human being, so at this level we can recognize, no matter their geographical or time context, the revelation, the discovery will be the same. Of course, in human and natural science is the easiest way to show, but also we can have it in human, in morality, ethics. We can achieve a certain level. We shall not be bad, we shall do good. What is the good? We are also able to reach those discoveries, and also referring to the characteristics of the being, not, of course, we don't have time for those terminology, the values or ideal. They are ideas. The realistic philosophy shows us the good, the truth in its being. We are not constructing it, we are discovering. So this discovery about the natural intellect also allows us to build such a school. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I mean, just to go to the question that was raised at the back there, I guess I would see the school as a moral community that is concerned with the socialization and education of children and apprentice scholars, introducing them to the community and to the world. That has been thought and said through what adults collectively determine children should know to be part of the community of universal humanity. And I know that sounds incredibly pretentious, but the best and easiest way to for younger children is through the nation state, and I think it's entirely possible to do that without being overtly nationalistic and jingoistic about it. I think we do children a disservice if we do not only deny them knowledge of their own nation, the geography, the history, the culture of that nation, but also I think part of that is about allowing children to have heroes, historical heroes and inspirational stories and figures they can look up to from the past to perhaps emulate as role models as apprentice adults. And again, I don't see need worry about being overtly nationalistic or jingoistic about allowing children to see things in their national story, their national culture, that they can actually take some pride in. And I think as apprentice scholars then, the values that we want to instill in young people through the school are of diligence, of hard work, of commitment, of a search for the truth, attention to detail. And again, I think teachers can serve as both role models and through the introduction to the world of knowledge, actually encourage children to practice and take on board these values for themselves.
If I may, I'm not just a professor at the not-so-free University of Brussels. I'm also the president of the Lux Mundi Foundation, and we are starting a new liberal arts college in Flanders. So very close to Antichrist. And it's based on the 7 classical/capital virtues: fortitude, temperance, justice, love, or charity, if you like, hope, faith. And the 7th one escapes me now, because I need a coffee. But the motto, which is taken from someone who's now a saint in the Catholic Church, is not religious in nature. I'm reading it out from the business card, and I won't ask our excellent translators to translate all of this, because this is a bit, a liberal education does manifest itself in a courtesy, propriety, and polish of word and action, which is beautiful in itself and acceptable to others. But it does much more. It brings the mind into form, perceiving things as they are. That's John Henry Newman for you, who thought a bit about education.
Thank you. Just to build on what Joanna was saying, agree with a lot of your points, but I guess, my school would be grounded in liberal humanism and that tradition that goes back over centuries. And I think I think identity can exist at different levels. I think we should be introducing children to different identities. They should learn about, but a curriculum is also about who you are and where you're from, okay, and what we believe as people. So it's going to be European. It's going to be from our country, but it doesn't just have to stop there. We teach children to transcend their context and learn about the rest of the world. So, but at the moment, I don't think we're not getting that socialization into any community really. So I don't think they're becoming global citizens. I don't think they're becoming European citizens unless you teach them the knowledge and values of your culture. Then they're not going to be socialized into any community. In fact, what we're seeing is that the opposite, and this is what I write about, is that. Children are this. We don't really have a connection in the curriculum between the past, present, and future. Children are being taught that the past is problematic. The past of the nation. That industrialization was really bad because it led to lots of pollution and climate change. and then the future is also seen as fearful, as problematic. So, that's not happening. So there's not really any. It's not a significant socialization taking place.
I'm not sure why Stuart mentioned jingoism. I don't think anything anybody has said or written about classical education implies that they are wanting a jingoistic curriculum. The word nationalism is compromised in the eyes of some people, unfairly, in my opinion. I mean, it's a difficult word to use. It puts people off. Nationalistic is not something that people say when they are praising someone. They say something like that when they're criticizing someone. But the word that I've always used is patriotism. Patriotism is a word that has many supporters. You've got Alistair MacIntyre, the greatest 20th century moral philosopher, saying that patriotism is a core moral virtue. And he was someone who in many ways has been extremely critical of assumptions about objective morality that have dominated our talking about morality in previous centuries and millennia. And a variety of people, even on the left, find patriotism perfectly acceptable, and that's what I'm advocating as a consequence, an indirect consequence, not an open purpose, but an indirect consequence of making sure that a curriculum in schools inducts children to the society in which they live. The problem with religion is, in a country which is overwhelmingly Christian, there was no problem when I went to school about having a Christian education in the state system, because it was a Christian country. We still have an established church. The king is still head of the church. The bishops are still in the House of Lords ex officio. We're a Christian country, but in practice we're not, partly because we had a succession of governments which have allowed large numbers of non-Christians to come, with the result in many parts of London, Christians are in a tiny minority in schools. The schools are overwhelmingly Muslim or Hindu or whatever, with one or two white Christian pupils somewhere at the back of the class. In that situation, I think they should all learn about the country's history. They should all learn about the religion that has shaped the country, but you will have to make accommodation for the fact that Christianity is not their religion. And in the other schools, in the schools where there's a Christian/white majority, it's important that they learn even more about the history of Christianity and its role and the nature of the religion. But at the same time, in a minority part of the time, and this is what we were very clear about in the national curriculum, in a minority part of the religious education curriculum, they learn something about other religions as well. Because it's important as a citizen of the UK to know about what your neighbours believe. But most of the time in religious education classes, supposedly, according to laws that haven't been revoked, should be devoted to the study of Christianity.
That is our conclusion for the second panel. Joanna, Alex, Artur, Cornelis, and Nicholas, thank you very much. Děkuji. And Enikő will talk about dinner.